Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for this next episode of Ships of War, my series in which I look at famous and sometimes not so famous and occasionally notorious fighting ships in their historical context, but also in terms of how they are represented in some of the games in my collection. And while just having a bit of a natter about these ships, I'll try to establish just how fairly the game treats them. So today's video came out of an interesting conversation I had about the card game Atlantic Storm. The challenge I was set, a friendly challenge by a friend, was to think about what is the most simplistic naval game I can think of in my collection that you could just about call a war game. And how does it treat particularly famous ships? Now, there's a challenge, isn't there? So I decided I would hit on Atlantic Storm because it is quite a simple, straightforward rule system, which I have reviewed elsewhere on the channel. And what more famous ships could I think of within Atlantic Storm than the German battleship Bismarck and the British battleship HMS Rodney? Now, the choice of antagonists might strike you as a bit strange. I mean, very often the Bismarck is compared to the Hood, and this makes sense because they both, in some respects, were fairly similar vessels. They weren't dissimilar in size, they had very similar armament. And their entwined tragic fates, Hood sinking on the 24th of May 1941 at Bismarck's hands, and then being avenged by the Royal Navy when Bismarck in turn is sunk on the 27th of May. Their stories are entwined, and they make for very natural comparisons. So in a sense, because of that, I decided, even though Hood is in this game, that I would not line those two up against each other because it's been done so often by far better people than me, and in very great detail. A lot of ink has been shed, and similarly, a lot of learned discourse has passed online and in debating halls. So I was going to leave that pair alone. The other possible vessel that I could have lined up against Bismarck would have been a member of the King George V class battleship, perhaps even King George V herself, as she had a hand in Bismarck's demise. But again, I decided to back away from that because that too is a comparison that has been made ever since the Admiralty conducted a detailed study at the very end of May, beginning of June 1941 to establish just how the Bismarck class lined up against the King George V's, Germany's most modern versus Britain's most modern. So with that in mind, why have I gone for Rodney? Well, that's a good entryway into the background for these two ships. The reason I've picked Rodney is because although she, in some respects, is a bit of a mismatch for Bismarck on paper, she was there in at the kill when Bismarck was sunk. And although there'll be a lot of debate forever about the specifics of who hit who and what did what, it's generally accepted that Rodney did most of the heavy lifting when it came to reducing Bismarck to a state of floating wreckage. I won't get into the debate about whether Bismarck was scuttled or finished off by Dorsetshire's torpedoes, because that's another exercise for another day. But I think Rodney is often the poor relation in the Bismarck narrative. She doesn't get as much airtime in many of the accounts as I think she should have. So she's here lined up against Bismarck. Now, how do the two compare? For one, you can tell their lineage. I mean, Rodney, as you can see from the picture on her card, has these almost, 1920s Art Deco, beautiful lines to her, but is a very strange looking ship. She's an odd creature from a time when naval design was changing quite dramatically. Bismarck most people would agree, looks like a much more conventional battleship. You know, she's got the amidship superstructure, she's got main turrets fore and aft. You know, this is the familiar geography of a battleship when you look at most of the world's navies. And of course, they do hail from very different periods. In fact, the age gap between them is really quite significant. So, Rodney was completed and entered service with the Royal Navy in 1927. The Bismarck, of course, by comparison, was brand spanking new in 1940 when she commissioned in the German Navy. And the irony is that although Bismarck was a much more modern battleship, her design was very heavily based on the old Imperial German Navy's Baden class battleships. Now, the Badens were the most powerful battleships that Imperial Germany produced, and until the construction of Bismarck, they were essentially the last proper battleships that Germany produced. So it's not surprising that when German naval architects finally were permitted to build full-size battleships, they looked to the Badens for inspiration. Now, there was a trend for a while to regard Bismarck as little better than a marginally improved Baden, but I think this does her a disservice. Yes, I would say there's a good 70 to 80% of Baden in her, but she was a significantly improved ship. And while they hadn't been able to directly implement changes, basically because they hadn't been allowed to build battleships, there was nothing stopping German naval architects from keeping abreast of the technological developments, with the really quite rapid ones that characterized the 1920s and the 1930s. Rodney, by contrast, represented a completely clean break from the Royal Navy's former thinking in battleship design. The Royal Navy had finished the First World War with the superb Queen Elizabeth and Revenge class battleships. But as the decade of the First World War began to give way to the 1920s, and before the Washington Treaty put a brake on battleship building, the British were beginning to turn their thoughts towards new designs that would be future-proofed for a new era. And none of these ships ever came into being, and they're remembered only by their alphanumeric designation, the G3 battle cruisers and the M and N series battleships. And when you look at the surviving design drawings for the G3 class battle cruisers, you can see an awful lot of Nelson and her sister Rodney in them. They essentially are reduced G3s. The British were able to argue for permission to build these two battleships in the wake of the Washington Treaty, but they had to compromise. They were bound by treaty limitations in the design. But nonetheless, they did have enough wiggle room to try out something completely different. So you had British battleships emerging with triple turrets. This was basically, this was the first time Britain took a step into adopting the triple turret for a battleship. The designed armor protection was radically different, and the shape of these ships, they look like nothing on God's earth. And just in case the pictures here are not very clear, I've got slightly enlarged versions. So there is Rodney, and she looks completely unlike any British battleship that has preceded her. People tended to either regard them as beautiful and imposing or rather ugly. And the debate still runs on about that one. But you can see the very odd arrangement where her three turrets are all concentrated forward, slightly to the detriment of C turret, which doesn't really have any. It suffers from having very limited arcs of fire. And then you've got the superstructure crammed at the stern, and interestingly, hardly anything, nothing in the way of heavy armament astern. And if you think this is odd, it is. But bear in mind the French and the Italians were experimenting with very similar designs at the time, and by the Second World War, both had built very similar warships. And just to keep things even, there is a picture of Bismarck as fairly recently completed. I mean, she had a very short life anyway, so there was not much that changed. But you can see what I mean about her being a much more conventional looking battleship. But I'm also just going to quickly point out the main difference externally that you can see from the Bardens. The old Imperial Navy Bardens did not have such a splendid flair to their bows, and they're very straight-stemmed, very brutish looking ships. Bismarck has been given this much more elegant hull form, and it's epitomized by this lovely bow, which was the sort of thing you needed if you were going to go steaming out into places like the Atlantic. And of course, when you look at photographs of Baden and Bayern, of which there are a good number, their superstructures are really quite minimalist in keeping with the thinking of the First World War. But by the time Bismarck comes along, the various paraphernalia that a warship needs, detection systems, gunnery control systems, various other secondary systems, advanced communication gear, all these have caused a big bulking out in the superstructure, but it's still been quite elegantly executed for all that. A very fine, balanced looking ship there. So to move on to the game and how these two monsters are represented, you'll see that there's not very much on these cards at all. The logos at the bottom left are merely their victory points. There's a brief vessel history. I've covered the fate mechanic and the period of service in my review of the game, so I'll leave those alone. So being a very high level, almost strategic game, Atlantic Storm does not bother with anything other than a unit's combat capabilities, the assumption being that the losing side in a round loses all their units. So what we have here are the anti-aircraft ratings, the top number, the surface combat ratings, the middle number, and the subsurface or underwater combat ratings. So how fair is all this? Now, Bismarck's been rated a 2 and Rodney has been rated a 1. This is really difficult to quantify because Rodney's anti-aircraft armament evolved massively over the course of her life. This ship served throughout the Second World War, and when you compare her anti-aircraft armament in 1945 to what it was in 1927, or even in 1941, it has become pretty formidable. If I take the spring of 1941 as a good comparison date, because that would have been when these two ships met each other in battle, I would actually question that very slightly, because in terms of number of anti-aircraft barrels, the two ships were fairly evenly matched. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think there was that much to pick between their detection systems either. The British did have the checkered high-angle control system that they developed. I think Rodney had a Mark III. I might be wrong about that. I'm pretty certain she had Mark IIIs. But the British system was, in some senses, an unfinished one, and British anti-aircraft performance during the first half of the war was rather sketchy. But in terms of number of guns, they were evenly balanced. And to be fair to the British, German anti-aircraft capability was not really that much better, certainly not in the early part of the war. And Bismarck is a case in point, because there's one of the curious factors in the Bismarck chase, as it's known, is the battleship's failure to bring down pretty much any of the aircraft that attacked her over the course of the campaign. And this was a rather critical failure for a modern battleship with supposedly modern systems. Now, The popular tale is often told, partly to big up the poor British Swordfish torpedo bomber, that they were so old and obsolete a design that the German predictors were incapable of dealing with aircraft that was so slow. That is, according to German sources, untrue. The Germans knew all about the Swordfish. It was not an old plane, it had been introduced in the mid 1930s. And the German observers in peacetime had seen this aircraft in action. They knew that the Royal Navy would deploy it and they knew what its capabilities were. So to imply that the Germans, who are quite, have a well-deserved reputation for being thorough folks, would have gone to sea unable to counter an aircraft like that is actually quite ludicrous. What it did prove, what all navies learned to their, painfully throughout the Second World War, was that bringing down aircraft with anti-aircraft gunfire, especially in difficult conditions that you often find in the Atlantic, was not the easy game it was supposed to be. So I think I would slightly take issue with Bismarck's rating of 2 for anti-aircraft. I would be tempted to nudge that down to a 1, or, raise Rodney, but I think it would be more realistic to knock Bismarck down 1. So what about the middle rating? Because this is the really interesting, controversial one that people want to talk about. Rodney has a surface combat strength of 6. Bismarck has these 2 question marks, and in game terms, when you commit the Bismarck to battle, you roll 2 6-sided dice. Each question mark denotes 1 dice, and you sum the total. So Bismarck in this game is very much an unknown quantity. On a good day, she'll roll a double 6 and carry everything before her. On a bad day, she'll roll snake eyes or almost as bad and just prove to be something of a damp squib. It's a very interesting mechanic that keeps the game very tense, but it does make for a rather poor comparison of both the ship's capabilities. And I suppose this would be a good time to talk about just what those capabilities were. So in terms of surface armament, Rodney, on the face of it, tops out as the much stronger ship because each of her 9 guns was a 16-inch weapon, whereas Bismarck carried 8 15-inch. Now, a pure comparison of the numbers would suggest that Rodney had a huge advantage there, but it was not necessarily so. Rodney's guns were older, but this was offset by the fact that she had been designed very forward-thinkingly with 40 degrees of elevation for her guns. In fact, that's actually slightly better than the elevation Bismarck enjoyed. So Rodney, despite the age of her systems, was actually in a fairly good position there. But nonetheless, her loading mechanisms were older than Bismarck's, and it did mean that her guns fired somewhat more slowly. In terms of hitting power, there was a great deal more weight of shell behind Rodney, but in real terms, the 15-inch gun was a very powerful weapon. All of those in every navy were quite potent. And generally speaking, 15-inch and above could be guaranteed with a square hit to make holes in or at least seriously damage even the strongest armor. So Rodney could punch harder than Bismarck. She couldn't necessarily punch further. And in fact, another factor worth considering is the German targeting systems. Their optics, particularly in their range-finding systems, were more advanced than Rodney's. So that's another factor that needs considering in this. In terms of secondary surface armament, there wasn't that much to choose between them. Rodney carried a total of 12 6-inch guns in small twin turrets, which was another break from previous British design practice. Bismarck had a similar arrangement, 12 secondary guns. These were 5.9 inch and they were also in weatherproofed gun houses, but essentially the same capability as Rodney there. So, taking all these thoughts into consideration, I suppose Bismarck has a 50-50 chance of beating Rodney. I'm not an expert in dice statistics, so I'm making an assumption there that you'll have half a chance of beating a straight value of 6 with two six-sided dice. So it is sort of fair, I suppose, and it is a clever mechanic in this game for making the dispatch of Bismarck on a somewhat risky affair, which is what it's meant to feel like in this game. I am tempted to say it's worth leaving them at that in terms of how this game works. And of course, we come to the final rating, zeros for subsurface capability. Generally speaking, I totally agree with that because Bismarck had no anti-submarine capability whatsoever. And she never even carried torpedoes. When the class was designed, the Germans had made the decision that this class of capital ship was not to carry torpedoes. Interestingly, her sister Tirpitz was later refitted with torpedo tubes taken off the cruiser Leipzig, but Bismarck never had them. Rodney similarly had no anti-submarine capabilities, but interestingly enough, she did carry torpedo tubes. She had 2 tubes for 24.5-inch torpedoes, which were quite a powerful weapon. She wasn't the first British battleship to carry torpedoes, but she was the first to have them in forward-firing torpedo tubes. Very aggressive setup. But one questions, even in the 1920s, whether this was a sensible arrangement and a good use of space. She did fire her torpedoes at the Bismarck during the epic battle which saw the Bismarck sunk, although it's debated whether any of her torpedoes actually hit or not. I think the British tend to claim they did. The Germans are not so sure about this. Or if they are sure of the hit, they're not totally sure it came from Rodney. I think it's one of those that will never be adequately solved. If anyone, I'm working on the assumption as I talk that just about anyone who's interested enough to be watching this series probably knows the Bismarck campaign fairly well. But if I have made a terrible assumption there and you've never come across the specifics of it before, then my apologies. You're probably wondering why I didn't say anything about what the outcome was when I was comparing the two ships' gunnery abilities. I'll just briefly dwell on that. The two did fight each other, of course, which makes for a very interesting comparison. But some factors need to be borne in mind, and one is that Bismarck was hobbled when the fight began. Her radar had been damaged right at the outset of the campaign by the shock of her own guns, ironically, and had not been satisfactorily put right. And also, more critically, the Bismarck was forced to steam in circles by the damage to her rudder from one of the Swordfish torpedo bomber attacks that she'd endured. So Bismarck was unable to maneuver properly. Now, in ordinary terms, this would not affect her gunnery as adversely as is sometimes made out, because at the end of the day, if you're her gunnery officer, you just have to take into account that she's steaming in circles, and that in itself does not make your calculations difficult. What did make life for the Germans was 2 factors. One, the fact that your ship is steaming in repeated circles makes it difficult for her to counter the maneuvering of her enemies. But also, more seriously, the deteriorating weather conditions on the day made Bismarck's course somewhat erratic, and that caused problems. It did affect British gunnery control as well, but you could fairly say that Bismarck had more problems on the day. Now, the two British heavy hitters who ganged up on her were the modern battleship King George V and the somewhat elderly Rodney. But as I said at the beginning, it was Rodney that did most of the heavy lifting. She knocked out it confirmed that she knocked out three of Bismarck's turrets and inflicted further damage. And it may even have been one of her shells that eliminated Bismarck's command crew and damaged the forward superstructure very badly. So, although in his report after the battle, Captain Dalrymple Hamilton claimed that he thought Rodney's gunnery had been rather subpar, he was mainly complaining about the length of time it took them to get the range properly. But looking at the damage inflicted, Rodney put in a really creditable performance, taking out a, yes, wounded, but nonetheless much more modern battleship than herself. Bismarck, conversely, failed to hit any of her assailants on the 27th of May. She scored a near miss, which showered Rodney with splinters and also damaged the cap of her starboard torpedo tube, but she never landed a direct hit, so Rodney's protection was never tested by Bismarck's shells. Bismarck, but in contrast, her protection scheme was very heavily tested. And she stood up to the pounding admirably. It was literally death by 1,000 cuts. And of course, one wonders whether gunfire on its own would have sunk her. She was in a terrible state. Her combat capability was very rapidly broken quite early in the engagement. But the German habit of designing for as close as they could come to unsinkability was certainly visible on that day. And now that's not to say that even if the British had given up and steamed away, leaving a blazing Bismarck behind, she would not have survived. A vessel in that state, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, having lost power, lost propulsion, suffering from heavy and actually fairly uncontrolled flooding, her fate would have been sealed. But this video is not really the place to get into that debate, so I'll leave that one for now. So I'm afraid in terms of Atlantic storm, there's not actually that much more to be said in comparison of the two ships, but I feel that it wouldn't be complete without just bringing in some of the other factors I normally talk about that I haven't touched on. So the first is survivability, and again, this has to be theoretical because Rodney, funnily enough, was actually more heavily damaged by the shock of her own gunfire because she went to full broadsides quite early in the engagement, which put a massive strain on her structure, and she suffered from popped deck plates and broken structural supports and all sorts of things that needed to be put right afterwards. But in terms of survivability, I think Bismarck came off better. When you look at the plans of the two ships, and they've been published in many, many sources, from the works of Oscar Parks and Eric Groener up to much more modern reference works, you can see that Bismarck enjoys much better and more comprehensive subdivision than Rodney does. So her ability to withstand flooding is noticeably greater. She's also a much more stable gun platform. The difference in length and beam between the two ships is noticeable. So the overall length for Rodney was 710 feet. That of Bismarck was somewhat over 800. So that's a good bit of a length advantage over her British adversary. Rodney, as completed, was a fairly beamy ship at 106 foot maximum beam. Bismarck topped that at 118 foot and a smidge. So, they're both fairly broad-beamed ships, but again, Bismarck has a very, very slight advantage there. And lastly, there's their speed. Bismarck was designed and proved capable of going at a maximum speed of 29 knots. And significantly, that was 29 knots in all weather conditions. Now, normally, a warship will be capable of a maximum speed in fine conditions and a much lower speed, or a noticeably lower speed in bad weather conditions. This was certainly true of the King George V's, Britain's most modern battleships. And I'm afraid it was true of Rodney. One of the compromises that had been made when she was designed was that they would go all out for heavy guns and a fairly heavy and comprehensive, well, no, not comprehensive, an all or nothing armor protection scheme, of the sort that the US Navy would recognize. But the compromise and the price that was paid was that Nelson and Rodney both had I'll call it an uninspiring speed for the day. They were supposed to have been able to reach about 25 knots as designed. They never reached that. Rodney's best service speed approached that, funnily enough, when her men were forcing her every bit of speed they could get out of her to chase Bismarck down. But generally speaking, her maximum speed was in the region of 23 knots. And by World War II, it had actually deteriorated closer to 20. And even then, she was developing a bit of a history of breakdowns and minor machinery failures. So speed was her Achilles heel. In better circumstances, if Bismarck had wanted to, she could have simply run away from Rodney, and there wouldn't have been much Rodney could do about it. The only other thing I've not touched on is armor protection. Now, much is made of the fact that Bismarck was supposed to have been this incredibly heavily armored beast, possibly even, some sources say, the best protected battleship in the world in terms of her armor protection. Now, I'm afraid this is challengeable by a lot of ships which were around at the time, including Rodney. Now, Rodney's protection system was somewhat older than Bismarck's, but that didn't mean it was bad. Rodney's designers followed the tried and, well, theoretically well-tested all-or-nothing protection scheme. And it proved to be a good scheme where you deliberately sacrifice protection in a certain area of the hull to maximize protection of critical areas. And this is why Rodney's armament was grouped so tightly, along with her machinery spaces and magazines, that armor was arranged in a very thick box around these critical areas, and the ship's ends were left pretty much unarmored except for really important areas. Now, Bismarck followed a slightly different protection scheme. You can just about see the line of her armored belt along the hull. Sorry, I'll put the photograph in a slightly better. There we go. So you can see her more conventional protection scheme where she's got a much longer armored belt. And she had very comprehensive deck protection because, of course, in the 1920s, deck protection, it was appreciated that it was important, but no one was thinking as much about aerial bombs as they should have been. And who can blame them when these ships were designed? Biplanes were just about the most dangerous thing you would meet out at sea. When Bismarck was designed, everyone was worrying about metal monoplanes that could carry much heavier bomb loads. And also, theoretical elements of naval gunfire had advanced somewhat and were better understood. So Bismarck's layout was more modern. Rodney's armor layout was dated, but still good, quite fit for purpose. If you're wondering why she's got this lovely flush-looking hull with no evidence of an armor belt, it's because her armor was actually very cleverly internalized, and it was angled 15 degrees off the vertical to improve its protective capability. So quite forward-thinking for the time. That was a feature that was still being built into modern battleships when Rodney was considered somewhat long in the tooth. But what about armor thickness? Because that is often used as a benchmark to consider who the better protected ship is. Well, let's look at some figures which I've got on a cheat sheet next to me. So Both ships had belts, belt armor along the hull, Bismarck slightly longer than Rodney's and covering a greater area, but it was shorter. Sorry, in terms of vertical, it was vertically shorter. Rodney's belt varied. It was 14 inches of steel at its thickest, tapering off to about 13. So it had quite a significant amount of protection. The box around her vitals was very strong indeed. Bismarck's hull belt was 12 inches at its thickest, tapering off towards 10 inches at the extremities, so somewhat thinner than Rodney. The turrets had very similar protection schemes with thin roofs, thin being relatively thin, very strong fronts and reasonably strong sides. So Rodney's turrets had 16 inches on the face, thinning slightly on the sides and rear, and a 7.25 inch of armor on the roof. Bismarck's turrets were 14.75 inches on the face, very similar to Rodney's, thinning as you went round the sides and rear of the turrets, and with a 7-inch roof. So again, slightly thinner than her British adversary. Both ships had variable deck armour. Rodney had very light plating on the parts of the ship which were unprotected. Bismarck tried. Her designers went for slightly greater coverage, but even they built in a difference between a specifically armoured deck with strong horizontal plates and weaker areas which did enjoy protective plating but nowhere near as strong. So just comparing the specifically armoured decks that the two ships had, Rodney's vitals were protected by 6.25 inches of armour at its thickest, tapering down to 3.75 inches. Bismarck's thickest was 4.75 inches, tapering down to 3.75 inches, much like her British counterpart, but again, somewhat thinner. So the armouring represented two very, very different design philosophies. But of course, Rodney's was not seriously, well, it wasn't tested at all in the Bismarck action. And although she had been damaged before, she'd been hit by an aerial bomb which had actually gone straight through part of her armoured deck, and she did suffer other damage later in the war. She was never put through what one would describe as an existential threat. She was attacked many times, but came through it, having led a fairly charmed life. Bismarck's protection scheme was put through the most horrific test imaginable, the combined fire of two battleships and a number of cruisers, and to be perfectly honest, I'll repeat the position I took earlier, that I think Bismarck's armour protection stood up to the punishment admirably. The only problem was all the survivability in the world, as I said before, couldn't alter the fact that the progressive hits pretty much destroyed Bismarck's combat power fairly early on in the game. And that, in a sense, that was a major factor in sealing the ship's doom. So there we go. A very brief look at comparing these two famous ships from the Royal Navy and the Kriegsmarine as they are presented in the card game Atlantic Storm. I do hope you found that interesting. I certainly had great fun looking into this one and dreaming up how I was going to put this one together. So as always, comments, suggestions, and so forth are always welcome. Thank you very much for following this series. I really hope that you've enjoyed this one, and I very much look forward to seeing you all again in the next one. As ever, really appreciate your company, and thank you so much for tuning in to the channel. I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Bye.